as redefined. Mosaic Judaism is only held by a minority of group. 132 Bar Kokhba revolt. They revolt against the 12th Legion. Rome never recovers. They never recover from that, but they took 3 years for the Romans to get their act together. They finally crushed that revolt. And but what's interesting, Bar Kokhba started rebuilding the temple, which gives us some clues as to where it really stood. And anyway, let's get to about the 3rd century. As you all know, Constantine legalizes Christianity as a state religion. Excuse me, just legalize it. It's a second successor after him that makes it the state religion. But he moves his capital of the world from Rome to Constantinople. In the West, we tend to overlook the implications of that. So the Roman Empire had 2 capitals, but the primary one was Byzantium. And it's Theodosius that makes Christianity the state religion. And then Muhammad is born in about 570. And of course, the whole rise of Islam happens quickly. Syria falls in 634, Jerusalem 630, a few years later. Next year, Egypt, a couple of years later, Persia. Within a generation, North Africa, Spain. But they're finally stopped by Charles Martel from conquering all of Europe. The rise of Islam is a major impact. It's in 614 the Persians sack Jerusalem, the Byzantines recapture, and that leads back and forth. And I won't go into all the details here. The Crusaders are, among other things, weakening the Byzantine Empire. But it's in the 12th century that Muslims recaptured Jerusalem under Saladin, and they encouraged the Jews and Christians to settle in Jerusalem and help them fight the Latin Crusaders. Saladin dies and the heirs fight, and it's obviously just a whole history of turmoil until finally the Ottoman Empire succeeds the Mamluk Empire in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's then in Turkish hands for about the next 400 years until after the First World War. And that's during that period the walls are built. The walls that you visit when you visit Jerusalem, walls you see are these walls, not the original walls. And anyway, it's in the end of the 19th century that the movement to regather Israel begins. This is significant because in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11, God says, "When I regather them the second time, that'll be the final time." That's what we've been seeing going on since the end of the 19th century. And Herzl, of course, was one of the major guys that energized this. When you get to 1916, there's a secret agreement that later surfaces between Britain, France, and Russia is also a participant, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And it's a secret wartime agreement between Britain and France agreeing to divide between them the lands of their enemy, the Ottoman Empire, once the World War ends. And among its terms was the establishment of an Arab state in southern Palestine, wherever that is. The impact of this, of course, is that the Arabs, when they discover this, are really incensed that Britain decided instead to engineer its own rule over all of Palestine rather than give them the independence that they'd been promised. And Britain essentially ruled Palestine as a colony until about 1948. And in 1917, we have the famous Lord Balfour Declaration. It's a short note from the Britain's Foreign Secretary to Lord Rothschild, one of Britain's most prominent Jews. It said, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This is regarded as a foundational document by Israel." And together with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, these 2 agreements really lay the foundation for the whole Middle Eastern morass that we find ourselves in now. The Versailles Peace Conference, Wilson argues for self-determination of the peoples, and the Arabs claim an Arab state from Iraq to Yemen. What's fascinating about the 1909 determination at Versailles is Palestine isn't even claimed by the Arabs at that time. We get to 1920, the San Remo Conference, and that's what granted the British a mandate over Palestine with the aim of encouraging immigration and settlement of Jews and the establishment of the Jewish national home. That's what they were mandated to do, and they worked against it throughout their whole administration. It's the British officials that instigate the Arab riots in Palestine. The rioters demand an end to Jewish immigration. That's what they failed to acquit themselves honorably of this mandate. And they installed the most anti-Semitic leader as the Grand Mufti in Jerusalem. And the League of Nations ratifies the British mandate over Palestine with the aim of rebuilding the national home. But then Churchill writes a white paper which creates Transjordan, what we know, east of Jordan, taking 78% of the land that was allocated for Israel and to create this state of Jordan. And finally, of course, I won't go through all these. Hitler ultimately becomes to power in Germany. Then we have the Nuremberg laws. These are signed by Adolf Hitler after one of his mass rallies. The laws provided the legal framework of stripping Jews of their rights as human beings, the first of which was called the Law of Safeguarding German Blood and Honor. This leads the groundwork for ultimately the death camps and so on. And this leads to the murder of the 6 million Jews that we're all well familiar with. And it went even the inability of the survivors, even after the war, to return to their home when Germany was defeated in 1945. And this injustice rallies the world's support to create ultimately the state of Israel. And the campaign of violence continues. In 1937, the Peel Commission of Britain asserts that the Jewish national home cannot be built in Palestine, and it recommends that a repartition of Palestine into a tiny Jewish state, 5% of the total area. What's fascinating is this plan is obviously rejected by the Jews. It's even rejected by the Arabs. When you study this history, one of the things that leaps out at you is what Abba Eban meant with his famous statement. He says, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And then there's the Munich Conference and the betrayal of Czechoslovakia. And you need to understand the background. I'm sorry I can't include it in this brief review, but you need to understand the background of the Czechoslovakia to understand what's really happening in Israel today. And most of you know the history, I think, since the Second World War. I'm going to deliberately going to skip through this quickly because I'm running tight on time here. Palestinian National Charter was in 1964. Realize that was when they had the West Bank. It was chartered to wipe out the rest. They're now, and so you really need to understand the ideology that lies behind that. And the Six-Day War, I think most of you are familiar with. We don't have to go through all that. You'll hear a lot about the resolutions 242 and 338. These are two Security Council documents following the Arab-Israeli wars, called for sides to renounce the acquisition of the territory. In other words, Israel give back what you earned in the wars. And so it's, again, one-sided things. There's the Yom Kippur War, the Camp David Accord, I think most of you are familiar with. Let me skip through this because it's the clock is ticking here, and I want to get to more immediate concerns to each you and I. And we had one memorandum after another. Needless to say, they were overly ambitious. They were based on a false premise. They were based on the premise that you could get peace by reducing the border of Israel when the enemies made it clear that nothing less than the extinction of the state was what they're after. So all these were fated to a failure. Let's back up a little bit. Since up till 1990, the Security Council and the UN passed 175 resolutions total. Do you realize that 55% of those were directed against Israel? The fact that 55% were even about Israel is astonishing. The UN has more problems to deal with. 97 of the 175 were directly resolutions against Israel. The General Assembly, during that period, passed 690 resolutions. 429 were directed against Israel, 62%. When you begin to understand the bias in the UN, you can begin to understand why Israel is not excited about having UN inspectors meddle within their problems. Let's take a quick look at their military. Their defense budget is 12% of their GDP, but they also get an additional $2 billion a year from U.S. military aid. They have about 173,000 active troops, but 425,000 reserves. They have about almost 4,000 tanks, U.S. made, and Israel made Merkavas. Merkava is the Hebrew word for chariot, by the way. So the vocabulary of prophecies are interesting. It's another study. But they have about 2,000 aircraft, most of them U.S., modified U.S. for their, among the modifications are the altimeters because they have to fly below sea level, interestingly enough. They have about 6,000 naval troops, 4 German-made submarines, which incidentally each one carries 8 cruise missiles with nuclear weapons. And those German-made subs, 3 or 4 were funded by the German government for them as reparations. We believe they have about 300 nuclear weapons. They have over 200 multiple rocket launcher type vehicles. They have over almost 1,300 surface air missiles with a 1,000-kilometer range. They do have chemical, biological, and, by the way, neutron bomb capabilities. Now, if you put this all together, If you take Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, they have apparently about 4 million troops altogether. And that gives Israel the benefit of the doubt. They have about 600,000. So they're facing a 6-to-1 odds. And if you remember the story of Gideon, those odds aren't big enough for God to really demonstrate his superiority. So we'll see what happens here. Tanks about 4